Its design was imperfect even for a late 18th century world, and it's all the more imperfect now. And there are just a number of weak points in the institution where things could crumble.
There's no question that a state could decide to cancel an election. That's absolutely constitutional under our system.
So the Electoral College has problems, but I think that advocating for its abolition, you would require a supermajority of states to get on board with it. Many of them would be giving up their own power and shooting themselves in the foot.
I don't think that the Electoral College is worth the kind of constitutional hardball and political hardball it would require to change it.
Is the Electoral College damaging democracy today? And if so, can we reach a consensus that is required for reform?
I think it's perfectly fair to say that large segments of the American population question the legitimacy of the Electoral College as an institution and consequently question the outcomes of elections that have been determined by the Electoral College. If we think back to our basic democratic values, it's simply a given in almost all circumstances that the person who wins the most votes should be declared the winner of an election. And we now have two examples of the person who did not win the popular vote winning the Electoral College. And in both cases, that president adopted policies that were very, very partisan, in effect been opposed by a majority of the people in the election. That in turn can, in a highly polarized society, jeopardize the rule of law as well as democratic institutions more broadly.
And that fundamental problem is, to me, the most important problem to solve. So the question is, how do we solve it? Some people have been doing that for a while. The National Popular Vote Compact, which is a compact among states that says that when the equivalent of 270 electoral votes have been committed to the compact, then those states within the compact promise to select electors consistent with the party of the winner of the national popular vote.
Currently, the compact comprises of 196 electoral votes in Democratic states, but was recently unable to pass in 2 Democratic-leaning states.
Another side effect of abolishing the Electoral College that most people don't reflect on, it would privilege people in major cities and urban areas because every candidate would just go where they could get a lot of bang for their buck in terms of media exposure because a vote's a vote.
Now opponents of the compact have placed the issue on the ballot in Colorado this November. And for the first time, voters will get to weigh in on the question of whether they support a national popular vote.
I also have a concern about whether the compact would be unstable because states can join it or leave it, and that creates the possibility that we would have one set of rules governing a presidential election this year and another set 4 years from now.
A significant problem is that 2/3 of Republicans oppose the national popular vote. A lot of people see the protections in the Constitution for small states as being protection against tyranny. And in that context, it's going to be difficult to convince them that this is something that needs to be changed. There's some popular misconceptions about the small state advantage in the Constitution. One is that this is a breach of democratic norms in a very serious way, that every vote absolutely should be equal. The reality is that a number of other countries around the world have systems that are somewhat similar. We're unusual, but we're not completely an outlier. And the second misconception is that the small state advantage strongly helps Republicans, and that just isn't borne out by the data. The small states and large states are pretty balanced politically. So if we look, for example, at 2016, the 16 smallest states split 8-8. Although there is a pretty significant disparity between the voting power of a voter in a small state compared to the voting power of a voter in a large state, there is almost no difference between the voting power of the average red state voter and the average blue state voter.
The overwhelming distortion, the distortion that happens not once every 10 years or 20 years, but in every single presidential election, is the consequence of something called winner-take-all.
Winner-take-all refers to a state awarding all of its electoral college votes to one candidate, the candidate who gets the most votes in the state, even if that candidate wasn't supported by a majority.
The consequence of winner take all is that almost all the states in America are determined before the election. In 2016, all but 14 states were absolutely determined before the election, which means that no rational presidential candidate would ever spend any time focused on any of those 37 states. Those states are irrelevant to the President of the United States. If you're a Republican in California, you already know you don't matter. But even a Democrat doesn't matter in California. All of these states don't matter. And so what that means is the presidential candidates are focused on a fraction of America, a minority of America. But swing state America is not America.
And another consequence of winner take all is that it makes voting less meaningful, less impactful in non-swing states. And you can see the impact in the turnout statistics, which are much lower in non-swing states.
Winner take all had nothing whatsoever to do with the intentions of the founders. Madison, this is very clear that he thought that the framers had no desire to use winner take all, and they thought that it was not a good system. Winner take all is one important reason that we can end up with elections where the popular vote winner is not the electoral vote winner. If electoral votes were divided proportionally or even by district, that would be much less likely to occur.
If I'm for anything, I'm for a proportional allocation of electors. There are only a handful of states that people campaign in because they're swing states. And if you had proportional allocation of electors, then you would have candidates going to any state just to try and rack up some support and votes, and it would even it out in a much more truly democratic way.
So there are other alternatives than just a status quo or a national popular vote.
Top two proportional is a new approach to electing the president that fixes nearly all of the problems with the existing system in a way that both sides can support. It's an amendment-based system that makes two simple changes. First, human electors are replaced by electoral votes that can be expressed in decimal form. Second, states allocate their electoral votes proportionally to the top two vote getters in the state. Those changes make it nearly impossible for a second-place candidate to win, and they give us at last a nationally elected president. To see how this works, let's take a state like Missouri with 10 electoral votes. Imagine results there where the Republican wins 60-40. The Electoral College votes would be allocated 6-4, proportional with the popular vote between the top two candidates. The fractions make every state worth campaigning in, because there are portions of votes available in every state. When the rules of the game change, the politics change. With winner take all, parties have an incentive to turn out their base in a handful of swing states. With top two proportional, parties have incentive to campaign nationwide. There are a lot of Republicans in California and New York, and there are a lot of Democrats in the Deep South. Those voters have been ignored. Their candidates do not come and visit them in a presidential campaign. And that weakens those parties in those states.
And what if the top two proportional was applied to past controversial elections?
So if you look back at the prior elections where the second place candidate won, and if top two proportional had been in use during those elections, 3 out of 4 times, the problem would have been reversed. The one exception is 2000, which was such a close election, it would not have reversed it in that case. But at the same time, that analysis is, it's a little bit flawed because you're looking at the results of campaigns motivated by a set of rules and seeing who would have won based on different rules.
And really, we have no way of knowing what would happen because you change the rules of the game, you change the entire architecture of the election.
Which brings us back to our conundrum.
At any given election, there are 9 or 10 things that could go very wrong that are related to the Electoral College. Sometimes the bad scenarios do occur. We've had second place candidates win. The collection of having potential explosions that always are in the background of our presidential system is intolerable, and it will eventually derail the country.
Historically in the United States, where we've gotten any significant electoral reform, it's been where there's an existential threat to both parties. Without that kind of existential threat to both parties, it becomes a partisan issue. You go back and forth and you get the same outcome every day of the week.
What we have is a situation where two sides are dug in and entrenched, and we're not getting close to fixing this problem. And in that context, we need a compromise. We need a solution that's in the middle that both sides can support.
The number of unintended consequences that could come from electoral reform, maybe it fixes this problem and maybe it doesn't. Maybe it creates an even bigger problem.
Reforming electoral institutions, once they already exist, is always a challenging task.
Because you are asking representatives and parties that have vested interest in a system, have been elected under that system, to choose to change it.
My own view is that if you get people to think through it, there's a form of reform, not necessarily to abolish the college, but to amend the college in a way that gives us 99% of what a national popular vote would give us.
And there are many reform ideas to consider.
And I think a popular vote with the runoff system would actually be a pretty good compromise, because it allows parties to build coalitions after the first round. It allows for multiple voices to be heard in the first round. I don't see that as being politically viable.
So what is politically viable?
This is a solution that may be able to thread the needle, that just does enough of everything to be achievable. A, it ends winner take all. It makes it almost impossible for a second place candidate to win. And what doesn't change? The advantage that small states get in the Constitution, it keeps the federal system of elections run on a state basis and with the results counted on a state basis.
Democratic reform has to happen when we get a majority, or maybe a supermajority, of Americans to agree, and then we get that agreement ratified, either in a law or in the Constitution. But the ultimate push is going to be to get conversation about what most Americans actually believe is the reform that they would agree to. And we hope at the end of that process we'll have something that allows people to step back and say, here's a reform America could agree on, and it's a reform that would make things better.